let's take a look at some more constraint options we have and some helpers that will make our constraint layouts a little more easier. And the first of those is creating chains. And so here I'm going to take a button and I'll put a button up above. I'm going to copy that and paste. And let's do a third button. So I have 3 buttons. I'm going to move this one up a little bit just for demonstration purposes. So I can take the 3 buttons and do a shift click to select. You see those 3 are selected there. Another way I can select is I can take my arrow and just drag a box around the 3. Notice they're selected there as well. I'm going to right click, and here we're going to create a horizontal chain. Now that horizontal chain takes those 3 items and creates equidistance between them along with the 2 margins to the parent. I'm going to undo that for a minute. I can also set up constraints to the left. Put that one at 16. I'm going to do the right one. I'm going to set that one up as 32. And then I'm going to take those 3 items, select them, and choose chain, create horizontal chain. And you'll notice now that the distance that is put between these and between the margins also includes the constraints I set up of 16 and 32. And you'll see it's a little more to the left than to the right. In fact, if I move this one a little more, that constraint, let's make it 60, you'll see this even more dramatically. So it's just a little bit of space from the 60, there's a little hash mark there where that 60 is, a little bit of space to the left of it, a little bit of space between the buttons, and then this one has the 16 and just a little bit of space. My 3 buttons are not constrained vertically at all, so they would all float up to the top. And I'm getting this little red exclamation mark saying that there's a problem there, they're not vertically constrained. So I'm going to take the first button and it's going to constrain it to the hello world. And we'll give it a distance maybe of 32. Now I can constrain the other 2 also to that same location, or once again I can select all 3 buttons and choose to align. In this case they're all the same size, so I could align bottom edges, top edges, or centers. So I'll align them on the bottom edges. That'll bring them all down. Now again, if I want to center these, I can change this last one, make this the same as the left button as far as its constraint, and now they're nicely centered. Buttons don't have to be the same size, so I can certainly take this one and make it larger. They're still aligned on the bottoms. And if I instead set these to be aligned on the top, you'll see it brings that bottom button down, and it's actually kind of encroaching upon the space of the text view. Might need to increase the distance for this button. And we'll make it 50. I'm going to click the last button and I'm going to clear the constraint that's at the top. Do the same thing on this one. That was from the constraining the tops of the buttons. Instead, I'm going to take these 3 buttons, select them, and I can choose Align Baselines. So anything that has text in it can be aligned on the baseline. Let's take a look at this running in our emulator. And it looks great in the emulator, pretty much what we were expecting. My text views are a little further down from the bottom, and that's because it's added the action bar up here at the top. I'm going to hide my emulator for a minute. I'm going to come into my Kotlin code, and I'm going to hide that action bar, and now I'm going to reload. And notice now the action bar is gone, and my text views have come up from the bottom because there's now more space. Okay, I'm going to do a couple more things. I'm going to, again, just going to hide my emulator. Go back to the XML. I want to bring this button back down to the same size as the other two buttons. So I'm going to choose to wrap content. So I'm going to select my 3 buttons. We've talked about chains, and I want to show you there are 3 different types of chains. So when we set this up, we chose horizontal chain, but there are 3 options here, and by default it accepted spread. And so the spread uses our margins that we set up and then puts equidistance between the items in the chain and the margins. The spread inside pushes the outside left and right objects to the margins, and the chain only creates space between the objects. So if I didn't have anything set up as far as margins for the left button and the right button, these would go all the way to the edges. The third type of chain is packed. And with packed, it removes any space between the buttons and equidistance them between the margins. I'm going to go back to the spread. There might be times when you want to have a button not be available to the user until some condition is met. I'm going to select the second button, and one of the attributes is visibility. I'm going to scroll down to the visibility attribute, and I'm going to click the drop down arrow here and make it invisible. Now notice when I do that, it hides it, but the object really is still there. It's still being used as part of my chain. And of course we can do this programmatically of making a button visible or invisible, and in this case it won't affect the position of the other 2 buttons. I'm going to make this visible. Now there's another option, selecting that button. Rather than invisible, you might have noticed there's a gone option here. So watch what happens when I choose gone. It basically removes the button from parent or from the constraint layout and doesn't apply it. Now again, I can do that programmatically, and I can then later come back and say let's make that visible and bring that button back. So that's the difference between invisible and gone. The invisible doesn't affect the layout, but the gone does. I'm going to select my 3 buttons. I'm going to right click and choose clear constraints of selection. And I can also make these buttons be a vertical chain. So I'm going to select those 3. Let's do a constraint from the bottom to hello world. And we'll give it about 16. I'm going to take the top, also give it about 16. And then I'm going to take these 3 buttons, select all 3, and now I'm going to apply a vertical chain. And that will make those equidistant between my margins and between each other. And then I probably also want to maybe align these, maybe on the left edges. And I'll just take the center one and set it center horizontally in the parent. So we can do chains both horizontal and vertical. Now I'm going to wipe out a couple of these controls here. I no longer have a bottom margin there. I'm going to set it down to the bottom margin. Again, let's do a little 16 here so they're even. And maybe in my layout I want my buttons to appear perhaps maybe down here at the bottom, but I want something up here that might change over time. So how can I constrain this so that they're not tied to any object other than setting a large margin from the top to push these all down? And so one of the helpers that we have in the tool palette, we have helpers, and there's a guideline horizontal and a guideline vertical. I can also add guidelines from the button up here at the top of this window. So I'm going to add a horizontal guideline. I'm going to position it, say maybe here. The guidelines also have constraints. So I'm going to set this constraint, maybe just do it 400. And I can also grab it and slide it as well. But I want to make my buttons equidistant between that guideline and the bottom of the screen. So I'm going to take my top button. Let's remove the constraint there, but instead I'm going to grab the constraint and I'm going to tie it, the top constraint, to the guideline, and we'll make it 16. And so now those buttons are equidistant between each other, and the margins I've set up of 16 top and bottom. If I select the guideline and move it, my buttons will also move. The guideline will not show up when we publish this to the emulator or to a device. They're simply there to help us with designing. And I can have multiple guides set up. So maybe I want to divide my screen into 3 sections, and I can kind of design each section based on the guidelines being used, using the guidelines as constraint targets. I want to look at one more helper, and that is a barrier. So we have horizontal and vertical barriers, and these are very similar to guidelines, but with a subtle difference. I've recreated my layout to have the text view and image view up here at the top. The image view is constrained center and constrained to the bottom of my text view. And then I have my 3 buttons down here that are not yet constrained, so we get the little red exclamation mark circles. What I'm going to do is add a barrier horizontal to my layout. Just going to drag it over, and you'll see it appears down at the bottom. It's almost unnoticeable. There's a little blue cast from it. I'm just going to drag that up here just so it's kind of in the order that I want it. I'm going to go ahead and give it a name because I'm going to refer to it with some constraints. So I'm going to call it HB barrier. And then I'm going to take the text view and the image view, and I'm going to drag them into that barrier. And I'll get a little blue line indented below that. We're not going to see them move in there, but instead we get when we expand it is there's references to those 2 objects being in the barrier. Now, my barrier has properties, and it appears up here at the top. So I've jumped from the bottom to the top. What I want is a barrier to be below my 2 items that are in essence inside of it. So in the properties, there's a barrier direction, and I want to set that from top down to bottom. Now my barrier appears just below the image view. I'm going to take my button and constrain. It's actually going to constrain to the image view, and that's okay. I'm going to change that. So I'm going to say to the bottom of the image view, and then I'm going to change this to the HB barrier. And let's make this 32. We'll take the right button, set up a constraint to the bottom, make it 32. Once again, I'm going to create a vertical chain of the 3 buttons. And somehow I did this to the text view and not to the HD barrier. There we go. And let's align these. So we'll take and align these maybe on the left edges, and I'm going to take this one and center it. Okay, so we have this barrier in the center now that's separating these 2 areas. And watch what happens if I expand the size of my image view. Notice the barrier gets pushed down, and the buttons then are reconfigured to that barrier. So a barrier is like a guideline, except it allows objects to reconstrain themselves as that barrier is pushed one way or another. If I were to make this really small, we would see that the buttons are now equidistant again, still between the barrier and the bottom and between each other. The last thing I'm going to do is show a group. So I'm going to take the hello world and my image view, I'm going to right click on those and choose Add Helper Group. So these are now part of a group again. I have group 2 down here as displaying the various views being in that group. But I can now work with these programmatically in code. So I'm going to take this button. So I'm going to go into my code and I'm going to create a function. So there's the function I created. It's called hide group. It gets group 2, which was the name of my group. I didn't bother to rename it. And then I'm going to set the visibility of that to either visible or invisible and use it as a toggle. So we're going to set this button up to use that on-click event for hide group. Let's try this in the emulator. If I click the top button here, that group gets hidden and I can bring it back. Come back and make this larger. That pushes that barrier down. And my button's a little more compressed. It's compressing a little bit more. And let's run this again. And that's even a little more dramatic. So that's working with chains, guidelines, barriers, and groups.